Rabbi Simon Jacobson, it's such a pleasure and privilege to be with you here in Israel and to talk about Jewish mysticism. You wrote Toward a Meaningful Life, and it sold so many copies and inspired so many among the other books and the beautiful shiurim and ideas that you share all over the world. But what is Jewish mysticism?
So first of all, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here, especially in the Holy Land, as you say. And maybe that's a good segue, because in the Bible it says when Jacob fell asleep on the Temple Mount, and then he realized where he was, he said, he called it Zeh Shara Shamayim, it's a gate to heaven. So in modern vernacular, you can say Israel's like a bridge, an interface between heaven and earth. And that's what Jewish mysticism is. You know, we live in a physical world with materialistic needs. We need to eat, to drink, to sleep, to make money, to provide for our families, to protect ourselves. But then there's another side to us, which is the transcendent side, what some would call the soul. And mysticism essentially is the study of the soul, the experience of the soul. You know, most simple example, people say, tell me about it. I said, you ever hear a song? What does a song do for you? Everyone, you don't even need to explain. It touches you, it resonates. So mysticism is like a bridge between heaven and earth, between your soul and your body, allowing you to experience in the material world something otherworldly.
Amazing. And you do that for so many, you connect so many people to it, but how did you get connected? Do you remember a moment, or what was the space or the time that brought you so deep into this?
It's a great question. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. My parents are both Russian born. They came to the United States after World War II. And I grew up in a traditional Jewish Chabad family. So I grew up with a very intense Jewish education, went to yeshiva. I'm just saying it for context. I think it's important to know where people come from. But what was unique in my life was that my family, my parents, both very loving, were not dogmatic. So my Judaism I grew up with was very warm and loving. You know, I know many of my friends, they grew up in very stern homes and very severe, God will punish you, and that's very negative. So that was and being by nature a skeptic and a seeker, it worked for me, because I don't know if it was imposed upon me, I would have probably rebelled. But I did rebel intellectually, in the sense where I started challenging what I was learning. I remember asking one of my teachers, one of my rabbeim in yeshiva, one of the teachers, I said, why do we learn all these intricate details, hair-splitting nuances in the Talmud? We could hire lawyers to read our mortgage documents. And he came over and gave me a slap. No, I was not traumatized. I don't need therapy, just for the record.
Thank you for clarifying that.
But he said to me, you're a protocol. It means you're a mutineer. We're going to see trouble from you. And lately I actually told him, that I did become a troublemaker because of you. My point is that I was challenging the axioms. Like I questioned the question, what is Judaism? What is God? Is this a man-made system to control people? I'm being very honest with you.
I appreciate it.
So, and that's what led me. I was like a rebel without a cause. I grew up with the Judaism, and I, again, was not molested. So I have no negative experiences with Judaism. But internally, it didn't resonate yet with me. It was more like, this is what you do. And I did it. I wasn't looking to reject Judaism. And it was ultimately in my teenage years, and I did a lot of reading. I have to say I read many other religions and many, especially Far East mysticism, Buddhism, and so on. And then someone introduced me a little to Hasidic thought, which I had studied, but I had studied very mechanically. And then something clicked. It was like music. I mentioned music. I used it for a reason, because it works for me. It resonated. And I said, oh, wow, it's the music of Judaism is what I'm looking for, not just the mechanics. Imagine just hitting the keys on a piano and no music comes out. That's what mitzvahs could be if you don't have a soul. And for me, it happened in a very profound way. It wasn't overnight, it was a journey. And I realized life is not what you see on the outside, it's all within. But I was looking if Judaism talks about that. Because when you read the Talmud, you don't always see that. The Talmud talks more about the intricate details of law. That tells you more like what to do, not why to do it and what's behind it. And once it began resonating with me, I'm like an extremist. Then I said, okay, I'm in. This is it. And it was for me a sense of like mission. that we have to do everything possible to teach, because I saw so many Jews, even my own colleagues, both in the religious world and the secular Jewish world, that had no idea that we have this treasure. And that's really, it was like music. And now I've been teaching music since, I always say I'm 17 years old with 51 years of experience.
Amazing. Well, you connected to one of the greatest mystics of our time, and arguably in many generations, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Right. What was your role with him, and what did he do for you as an individual, and what did you feel his contribution was?
Well, just to follow along I'm giving you my biography. So those teenage years, 17, 18, which are formative years. That's like when you're breaking away from being a child, starting to become an adult, thinking for yourself, who are you? As, your identity, who are you, independent of your parents and independent of your school. And the Rebbe was always a presence, because I lived in Brooklyn, Crown Heights, but he was like a king on the hill. I respected him, but I had no real, but once I began to so-called touch this music, the soul of Judaism, then I saw the Rebbe, I said, oh wow, I started understanding his words, because he would talk about this. But sometimes his traditional garb would make you think he's more of a biblical scholar type of thing. Then I realized, no, it was a revolutionary dressed in traditional garb. And I very much identify with that. I wanted access. So I began to get involved in the job, which was very unique, because on Shabbat and holidays, when the Rebbe would speak, no recordings are made. According to Jewish law, you don't record and there's no notes taken. So you have to use your good old brain to remember. Like the Jews did Torah Shabbat Peh, oral Torah. And I really was intrigued by the process. How do you remember hours and hours? And I got involved and I became good at it.
Did they teach you how to do that, or was it just
No, I learned on the job.
I don't think it's something you learn on the job. I think it's something you have.
No, you have, but like anything, you could have a talent if you don't cultivate it.
Wow.
So I cultivated. It was really about listening and absorbing. I mean, we can talk about that for hours, trust me. It was about how do you put aside your temptation to process information and just absorb, like a dry sponge. Because only dry sponges remember. A wet sponge, and most adult minds are wet sponges with full of even good ideas, but those ideas don't let you really hear new ideas.
So I think even if you're not just listening to the Rebbe's teachings and sharing it, that's something that we should all be doing. We should try empty out to be able to absorb in a real way.
As a matter of fact, it's a book I was thinking of writing about the secrets of the mind I learned from hours of remembering.
Wow.
It's really about allowing yourself to listen to another without getting yourself and your ego in the process, which a lot of people don't know how to do.
So there's a Rebbe, there's Hasidim, there's all these different parts.
So let me just, if I may,
yeah, of course.
So I got involved in that job, and I became better and better, and then I rose in the ranks, and I became the main writer of the Rebbe's talks.
Amazing.
Till 1992 when he had a stroke. And so I had actual direct communication. I have thousands of pages of the Rebbe's edits and answers to questions and queries that I presented. Then afterwards, I wrote Torah Meaning for Life after that. So that's my trajectory. But it was always, that job was always like, taking this higher wisdom and presenting it. I think I was blessed with the ability to understand it, but also even more difficult to present it in language to people who are not indoctrinated or were not taught Hebrew or don't know the concepts. That's the most difficult part, making it relevant.
Amazing. That's the challenge of today.
The music again, resonating relevance, right?
So if this music was resonating broadly, in an ideal world, would all Jews be mystics?
I wouldn't even use the word mystics. I would use it realists, because the reality today, I'll just use, I love physics and science, and I always saw the parallels between mysticism and science. If you ask anyone you don't even need to be a scientist to know, all that matter is really energy. So matter is just the outer surface, the tip of the iceberg. So I wouldn't call it mystics. If you really understand mysticism, you realize that's the reality. Like I'm speaking to you right now, am I speaking to your body or to your soul? I see your body and our lips are moving, and I see your eyes and face, but we're soul speaking to soul. So I would say everyone would be soulful. Maybe that would be the right way to put it.
So what animates the soul is God. What is God?
There you go. I was waiting for that question.
Oh, good.
It's $1 million question. I have a whole chapter on it in my book, Torah Meaning for Life. The problem I just need to say before I say what is, to say what it's not. Because there's a beautiful story, Levi Yitzchak Berditchev, the great 18th century mystic. He was once speaking to a self-proclaimed atheist, and he said to him, the God you don't believe in, I also don't believe in. In other words, the problem is the definition. For many people, God is like a nursery school fairy tale of a guy sitting with a long white beard in heaven, waiting to strike us with lightning when we misbehave. So if you told me that's your God, I would say I don't believe in that God. I'm an atheist too. So terms matter. So I'm very glad you're asking it. I would strip all the preconceived notions and the stereotypes and all the labels that people have used about God, and I would simply say God is the essence of all reality and beyond. That's how I would put it.
Essence of all reality and beyond.
And beyond.
How would you unpack that for someone?
So I would say, who are you? Before we talk about who are you, as I mentioned before, are you a sum of the parts of your body, your arms, legs, heart, brain, liver, lungs? Obviously there's more to it, because that's also, God forbid, a corpse is also that. So you have a spirit within you. I'm not even talking now in religious terms. You have something, you want to call it electricity, so be it, energy. But how far does that go? How far down the rabbit hole can we go? So let's take physics again. We know all matter is made up of elements, which are made up of molecules, which are made up of atoms, which are made up of subatomic particles. How far down can you go? So in a way, the essence of everything is very deep down. So God is like the core of it all, lying right here, except we don't see it because we only see the outer dimension. And that God, calling it God, that higher reality chose to create an outer reality, which is the surface layer of our existence. And ever then, the rest is history, we're trying to reconnect.
And what's the purpose then of the Jewish people?
Let's first talk about the purpose of all people.
Okay. What's the purpose of people?
So I'll quote the biblical statements. God says, I'm creating a universe. He creates it in 6 days, and then says, now I will create the human being in my image, divine image. I will put a creature on this earth that's unlike everything else, unlike the mineral, the vegetable, the animal, that will be, his role is to transform this material world into a home for the divine. So that's the purpose of all of existence. We're all here to take our material life and spiritualize it, turn it into a garden, into a beautiful home, civilize the world, and going against the grain of our selfish temptations to become people of service, to people of love, of virtue. In other words, basically, instead of narcissistic self-interest life, a God-centric life.
And that's basically all of humanity.
All of humanity. Now, as we know, Adam and Eve, were they Jewish? Good question, right?
Well, Jewish wasn't really invented then.
Exactly. So it became a process. Human beings began to search. They also made mistakes, major mistakes. So we consider Abraham to be, the patriarch Abraham, to be the first who went into a pagan world that had denied God and began to say something's wrong, something's missing. And he began to search. And in a way, sometimes he's called the first Jew. But he wasn't legally the first
because
Jew.
That only really happened after the Torah was given.
But he was, you could say theologically, he was the first Jew.
Yeah.
Because he embraced the idea that life is not just about me. There's something greater and higher. But more importantly, he taught it to his children. And hence the birth of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And then they had children, and that continued to pass on. After the exodus from Egypt came Matan Torah, the story of Sinai, and that's when formally God said, here's a nation that's committed itself to me, I will now commit myself to them, and gave them the mandate, the blueprint for life called the Torah. And that's what the Jewish people became, people of the book, to teach what God wants to each of us, but also to teach it to the rest of the world. And that's important to know.
So the purpose is really to teach the world
to lead the way.
God wants.
To lead the way. And look, even the Christians and the Muslims will say it all begins with the Jews.
Yeah.
However they explain it. But the bottom line is, this one man, Abraham, and this one woman, Sarah, today are the most,
billions of people.
Literally billions of people, and maybe almost the entire world completely reshaped by them, because they introduced essentially the concepts of virtue, of charity, of tzedakah, of justice, all the values we cherish today. I just say it because a lot of people are not even aware that the very human rights and the freedoms you have were not a given
Yeah.
300 years ago, there was no country on earth. The world was ruled by monarchs and by the church and by despots and by dictators.
And we take it for granted.
Exactly. So I look at, you talk about mysticism, Abraham was clearly a great mystic. But again, I use mysticism with a certain, because I look at it more if you really understand existence. It's, the mystical sounds exotic, like it's out there. But it's like saying that there's a soul. That's not so exotic if you think about it. So he introduced soul to the world, and today this has become very prevalent. And listen, we're continuing the mission that was given to Adam and Eve, and which is to bring soulfulness into a material world.
Another thing Abraham introduced was a formalization around prayer with the morning prayer service. So how does prayer work?
So prayer, I'll use again a biblical example. I think they're good. Again, Jacob. Let's go back to Jacob. He had a dream of a ladder, a sulam, a ladder that was firmly planted on the ground with the top of the ladder going to heaven. This is the classic analogy for prayer. When you pray, you're taking your material life and essentially connecting it. You're longing. You're looking up and saying, God, I want to speak with you. Let's have an emotion. It says, Avodah Shabalav Zuhi Tfilah, which he translated is that prayer is the service of the heart. If studying Torah is the service of the mind, exercise, the cognitive conditioning, prayer is emotional conditioning. It's emoting with your soul and the source of your soul, which is God. That's the essence of what prayer is. And in other words, you're not alone in this world, that you do have a relationship with this, what I call higher reality or the essence of it all.
Interesting. And you said that Torah studies about sort of the cognition and the conditioning of the mind. So what's the purpose of Torah study then? Well,
as human beings, we know you want to be a full human being, you want to have a cognitive and an emotional experience. The mind is more of a guide. Mind researches, discovers, analyzes. The heart experiences. So if you want another analogy, you could say the heart is like the ship, the mind is like the captain of the ship. So if a person wants to really live a meaningful life, a fulfilling life, their mind has to be in the right place, and of course their emotions, their heart has to be in the right place. So that's why you'll find very often in the Torah, in the Bible, you'll hear expressions, v'yadaita hayam, v'hashavaisa levavecha, which means know and feel, or know your God. Da'asa leke'avicha v'avdua b'levav shalom. So think of a relationship, let's talk personal relationships. Because remember, the relationship between a husband and wife is essentially a mirror of a relationship with God and man. And a good relationship is going to has a cognitive element. You have conversations with your spouse if you're in a healthy relationship, but of course it doesn't remain. It's not just a mind game, it's an emotional experience. So emotions are the experience itself, but emotions need guidance because emotions can get the better of us. Sometimes you need self-control. You need to harness your emotions.
You talked about the relationships between a husband and wife. Clearly there's a categorization of husband and of wife. Does Jewish mysticism view men and women differently or the same?
So I always go back to the sources, back to the videotape, the original rather. So it says, this is the verses in the Bible. They're really powerful. That's why I'm quoting them. So God says, I will create a human being in the divine image. And here's the expression. Male and female, God created them and then separated them. So here's your answer. Male and female are two parts of one whole. They're both equal in that sense. They both need each other. They play different roles, but they also have much in common. So in a sense, from a Jewish point of view, despite the stereotypes, men and women are equally divine, and as a matter of fact, the only way they really become completely one is when they join together, which is why the only time you can have a child is when there's a man and woman. So someone's going to say, what's more important in the birth of a child, a man or a woman? Actually, you can make the case more women, actually. That's why Chava, Eve in the Torah, is called the mother of life. You know what Adam is called? The dust of the earth. So who's inferior? But the truth is, in the eyes of God, there's no such thing as inferior.
You need both.
In the eyes of God, there's no inferiority. Inferiority is a political and a bureaucratic. And
it's also a human statement because it's not able to see a spiritual realm.
Exactly. What's more important in a person's life? The eyes or the ears, the mind or the heart? And as a matter of fact, there's 35 to 75 trillion cells in your body, in your being. which cell is the most important? God forbid one mutation can wreak havoc. So I think when you're dealing with, especially today, we understand on the microscopic level, a computer program, which line of programming is most important? Take out one dot, the whole program.
Yeah.
So I think we have to look at it. It's not as literal as.
And is Judaism meant to be easy or is it meant to be hard?
Both. So here's that. No, I like analogies, so I'll give you this analogy. If someone offered you 100 pounds of stones and said, if you carry it across the street or carry it, it's yours. Most of us would reject it. What do I need stones for? But if I offered you 100 pounds of diamonds, you wouldn't even hesitate. You'd say, give me 200 pounds. Now, 100 pounds of diamonds don't weigh less than 100 pounds of stones, but the value makes it worth the effort. So I would say Judaism is definitely has plenty of responsibility. It regulates your life. A lot of commitments. But if you see it as stones, it's a burden. If you see it as diamonds, it's very light.
I love that. It's a beautiful analogy. So why did God create the world?
You ask me all the biggest questions. Am I able to ever answer? I don't know. Okay, we only know what God told us. So what we find is that God says, I desired. This is an interesting word. It uses the word desire. And that's very precise. The Baal HaTanya, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, a great mystic in his own right, founder of Chabad Hasidus, community I grew up in, so it's close to me, my heart. So he explains when they say, so why did he desire? He says you can't ask a question on desire because he created logic. So you can't use logic to ask a question on the one who created logic. It's like asking, why did you create logic? So he desired, this is the expression in the Medrash, which is essentially oral interpretation of the Bible, of the Torah. He desired to have a home in the lowest of worlds, in this material world, which essentially is the sanctuary, the Mikdash. We talk about being in Israel. In Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, the place that every Jew on earth prays toward the east, is because the temple is essentially the home for the divine on earth. But he wants the whole earth to be divine. That's what we know. There is no why, because as I said, why is already a question that comes into the system itself. Einstein says that the only way to solve a problem is from outside of the system where the problem was created. So the same is true on the positive end. We know that God desired that, and then hence created human beings with intelligence. And look what we did. We did transform this world. Every time you look around, we took a world that was exposed to the elements, a wilderness. Who roamed here thousands of years ago, and we transformed it into a civilized planet. We've also done damage, but we've also done tremendous things. But look at the nobility, look at the beauty, look at the love. Talk about Abraham, the kindness that we brought love into the world.
Does this will of God and will of human beings apply in terms of free will? Meaning, can we do something against God's will? How does free will work?
Well, you're asking all the big theological thorny questions. So I'll try to be brief. Built into the purpose, you have to say there's free will. I mean, I'll use a famous joke. I think it was from Isaac Bashevis Singer who said, we must believe in free will. We have no choice. But what that really means is, if there's no free will, the whole thing is a joke. Then what, God created puppets and robots to play out a script that he's controlling? So as complex as it may be, free will is built in, inherent. Because if there's no free will, then what's being achieved? So the question, there is the theological question, how does God leave room for free will when he's all pervasive and all omnipresent? But I don't want to talk about that right now. The bottom line is, yes, that he gave us a part of his own essence that says, when it comes to not your height, not the color of your eyes, not, I don't want to use gender, but other things, there are many things you have no choice about. You didn't choose what family to be born into. You didn't choose what language to speak. You can learn new languages, but the color of your eyes, or your height, or other. But you choose right and wrong is up to you. If you choose right now to be kind to me, it's your choice. If you choose the opposite, it's your choice. And in some way, God, in his mysterious way, and there's many thousands of pages have been written on this, has suspended his own so-called hashgacha, his providence and his oversight when it comes to that point where you're going to choose. So the fact that you and I are sitting here is not necessarily up to us. God put us here, but how we'll use it is up to us.
What about the Messiah? What about Mashiach? What do you think about? This is a term that for some people just sounds like a term. Is it a practical, from a mystical perspective, what does it look like?
Absolutely, and I go back to the same story with God. The Messiah you don't believe in, I also don't believe in. I think Messiah, like God, are these most misunderstood. Well, furthermore, it's distorted words. I mean, I can tell you, I don't know how it is in Israel, but in the United States, the stereotypes around religious terms like God, Messiah, and so on are so deep that 90% of the work is not explaining what it is, but it's unexplaining
or explaining what it's not.
Dispelling the myths.
Yeah.
So the myths around Messiah are so many, and it sounds also this thing, Messiah, especially the Christian version of it, etc. So let me put it in just simple English without using any Hebrew. To me, it goes like this. This world, with all its intricate and fascinating design, was created by a cosmic engineer, otherwise known as God, for a purpose. The purpose we spoke about, which was to transform this material world into a spiritual environment. Basically to bridge heaven and earth. Okay. Messiah is the destination, the end of the process when it will be achieved. So take out that idea. That would be like saying, okay, the world is created by design. There's a purpose, but that purpose will never be realized. So Messiah is simply the realization of the purpose of existence.
What happens when we get there? Once we get to this place, is the world going to be different?
We're very close there. Look at the world in which we live in today. We mentioned before, we take for granted our freedoms. That's messianic, these freedoms. Because why shouldn't we be living in a world of survival of the fittest, dog eats dog, and just destroy each other? So I'm not saying there's plenty of work to be done still.
But we're close.
But we're far, yeah. Number two, look, we're sitting here talking about spirituality. There's a revolution in the air. So what will look like? It will look like a world where there was, I'll quote Maimonides, the Rambam, a world where materialism will only be a means to spiritual ends. So the idea of selfishness and greed and war and discord will be gone. That doesn't mean there won't be diversity. There'll be, but people will understand.
Diversity without discord.
Right, I'll call it harmony within diversity. It's when you really see people working together of different talents and skills. That's like a little taste of it.
We really need it.
Absolutely.
But
the beautiful story is that there are many people that are living that way.
For sure.
But there's more work to be done.
Where do you see the state of Israel? Is it part of the final redemption?
Well, the fact is you can't deny that today you have, 7 million Jews, the largest body of Jews ever. It used to be the United States. So that is a fulfillment of all the prophecies. We say in the prayers, the Jews will be gathered. But remember, the gathering of the Jews is not just a physical thing, it's also a spiritual thing. It means that we're reconnecting to our roots, to our homeland, to between the gate between heaven and earth. So it's clearly part of the process. I mean, there are different opinions, theological opinions of how much is it the actual part of the Geula, the redemption, or is it a step before? But we don't have to go into that. But everyone agrees, when you see recently a million Soviet Jews from the former Soviet Union, and generally a haven after World War II, and of course the renaissance of Jewish life in Israel. I mean, and this is our home, and it just continues. But there's two parts to the revolution. One is the actual being in Israel, and second is to be there spiritually. You can be there and not be there. You want to also have that renaissance.
So there's a lot of spirituality here, but we're not fully there.
Like we say in the prayer, even Jews in Israel say, because of our sins, we've been exiled from Israel. But what do you mean? We're living here, because you could be here and still be in exile.
It's like a spiritual exile.
Like, yeah, you can be out of prison, but still be a prisoner.
What is the greatest challenge facing the world today?
I think the disparity between our material success and technology, which is making life literally so easy, and our spirituality is not keeping up. So I think the biggest challenge is the area like our emotional lives, personal lives. Technology does not make marriages better necessarily. So I think the disparity, to bridge that's why I think we need such a heavy dose of spirituality today to counter those forces of technological and medical and political advances that are taking place, that disparity. You cannot have too much tension will be created between body and soul. And that's why I believe also the rise of opioid use and people looking to relieve their the tensions they have, to numb. And the answer is soul, neshama. Talk about mysticism. I actually don't like the word mysticism just because it sounds like it's some
exotic.
Yeah, and it should be something that should be as common as drinking water. It's our spiritual oxygen.
How has modernity changed Jewish mysticism, or has Jewish mysticism changed in modernity?
Absolutely. If you look at it and you see this is I see this as literally a divine miracle, a divine hashgacha, a divine providence. The rise of mysticism in Jewish life, remember, it was always there. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the author of the Zohar, we're talking about 2,000 years ago, but he only had 10 students. And it was kept very confidential, very discreet, for many different reasons. So it was always there. But it was with the Arizal, the holy Arizal, we're talking now 500 years ago, 600, where he began to say it's a mitzvah to start disseminating it. It was still limited because the language, the cryptic nature of it, but with the generations it began to spread. The Baal Shem Tov, of course, was the birth of Chassidus, and he had his students. Today, it's commonly taught to people that are not necessarily in the highest spiritual levels. So you clearly see the growth of it, but if you trace the roots, you know when the Baal Shem Tov lived? Right at the time of the Enlightenment.
Correct.
When the emancipation of the Jews. So the birth of modernity corresponds almost to the year when Pnimis Torah began to become more, I could say, more mainstream. And there was resistance.
But do you think there's a spiritual balancing of the scales?
Not only,
like
I think
antidote to
all the real Kabbalists all say that. They say it they actually give two reasons for the greater dissemination. Because the question, of course, is asked, if it was always kept so discreet,
why now all of a sudden?
why suddenly are you able to teach it? Why aren't all these limitations? And it could be abused. And it was. Shabtai Tzvi, the Frankists, they abused. Kabbalah can be abused. There was a reason there was resistance to it. It was legitimate reasons, because no one knew where once you open up the spiritual...
Can't close it again.
Yeah, and also, if someone doesn't know how to use it, they can abuse it.
Yeah.
They can turn it into things that were very inappropriate. And so, two reasons are given. One is when it's darker, you need more light. And the darkness was becoming... Remember, there was no assimilation of Jews 500 years ago. I mean, there were a few that maybe converted, but it was minimum numbers. Today, 80% of the Jewish people are assimilated. However you define that. And I'm not saying it as a judgment. I'm just saying it as a matter of fact. They're not affiliated. And it's mostly out of ignorance. We call it tinuk shenishba, someone that doesn't know better. So when there's more darkness, you need more light. There's actually a beautiful analogy for that from the Baal HaTanya, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, because some of his colleagues were saying, should Pnimis Torah Chassidus, mysticism, be taught to everybody? And as Ashgacha would have it, someone saw a page of a Hasidic discourse on the floor. So you see, it's not being appreciated. The Baal HaTanya gave a beautiful analogy. He said a king had a child who became gravely ill, and the doctors gave up hope. He was dying, and the doctor, for this was the king's only child. So he was desperate. So finally, some doctor came and said, I think if you take the crown of the king has the most precious jewel. It's a rare gem. If you crush it and you mix the powder of the jewel with water and you can get between his clenched teeth, it may save his life. But you'll never have that jewel again. And the king said, of course. Now what's the question? My child is more important to me than the crown. And that's what they did. So that's the Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the Alter Rebbe, said the Jews were in a very difficult situation. So God said, this is the time. Even though there may be drops of the water will drop on the floor.
It's a price that he's willing to pay.
Yeah, because the Jews need neshama, because they are going to be challenged in terrible ways due to the materialism of the world, due to the freedoms and so on. So freedoms are a blessing, but you have to have... So that's one reason given, because the more, like before the dawn is the darkest, so that's like countering. The second reason, interestingly, is before Mashiach comes, before the end of time, when spirituality will dominate everywhere. So it says before Shabbos, you have to taste of the foods of Shabbos.
Torah.
So the Torah. So the revelation of the inner dimension of Torah is like a taste of what will be coming. And they actually are interdependent. So the deeper revelation is due to the darkness, and the darkness brings out that deeper revelation.
And you said that you studied many other religions, doctrines of thought, ideas. What makes Jewish mysticism unique?
So first of all, I have no problem saying there's many commonalities. There's one God, and people found God, whether in India or in or Tibet or in Europe or wherever. So that's not actually, when I see commonalities, it just affirms. Secondly, Abraham had children that went all over the world, including to the east. So just to say that. Unique, and I may be subjective because I am Jewish, as you can tell. So I'm not trying to dismiss any other school of thought, because as I said, there's many commonalities and many truths. But what I find when I do read different schools, first of all, the Jewish perspective I find to be most comprehensive. So I think they have many common denominators, but you get the biggest picture. That's one thing. But two other things that really stand out. In most schools of mysticism, or maybe all, there's two realities: a material world and a spiritual. And the goal is to move from being a materialistic person to a spiritual person. In Judaism, there's a 1/3 step. It's called Kedusha, holiness, godly. And godly is not closer to the spiritual than it is to the material. So you really have 3 steps: matter, spirit, and God. And God joins matter and spirit. That's why most schools of mysticism, they teach you asceticism. You have to move away from matter to reach this. And Judaism says, no, you have to bring spirit into matter.
Yeah.
The second distinction is the focus on actions. In most schools of mysticism, the highest place that you can get to spiritual transcendence is through meditation.
Which is almost a lack of action.
And in Judaism, through a mitzvah, through a good deed, action, you can reach deeper than any meditation.
Amazing.
Those are 2 key things.
Beautiful. Does someone need to be religious to study Jewish mysticism?
Can I challenge you in return? What does religious mean? Does religious mean dogmatic? Does it mean mechanical? Let's say you teach a monkey to put on tefillin. Is that called a religious monkey? I don't mean to be irreverent. So the word religion is also a word that needs to be. I know what you mean by, however. So I'm not dismissing.
No, you're right. It's important to be
right. So my response would be as follows. Unfortunately, many people think the more religious you are, the less spiritual, and the more spiritual, the less religious. And there is that disparity. I will say, what I would rephrase your question would be like this. Do you need to be committed to all the Jewish laws, Shabbat, kosher, and so on, to study or experience mysticism? The answer is no, because I know many people that begin first on the soul journey, and then it may lead them, and often leads them, to Jewish ritual. But from the big picture, I would say it's like, do you need a body or only a soul? At the end of the day, what you call religion, or what I would call halacha, laws, is the body of Judaism. And mysticism is the soul of Judaism, and you need both. You could do one without the other.
Correct.
There are people that do the laws and they don't know about the soul.
So anyone can learn about it, but the highest level is to
And frankly, many people, the only entrance point is through the soul. They're not ready to keep Shabbos, but then they hear, oh wow, Shabbos is the day of the soul? Let me try it. You do whatever it takes.
They become sold.
Well said, yes.
So, you talked about people abusing Jewish mysticism. Can it be dangerous, Jewish mysticism?
Yeah, absolutely. In Jewish mysticism, there's a thing called Kabbalah Mysis. And then the study of Kabbalah, you could study mysticism. You study the ideas, the theology of it. And of course, that translates into the kavanah, the intention in doing a mitzvah, in prayer. But Kabbalah Mysis is like, maybe the classic one is the Maharal, when he built a golem. He built a man of clay. That is considered to be off limits. Even if it happens, it's very rare and only by someone that's extremely high level. So the idea of using mysticism like cantations or words and you try to manipulate existence, that's considered to be crossing a line. Because that's where it would be abusive. Another aspect where it could be abusive, unfortunately, spiritual masters, mentors, who people trust, and they abuse the trust, sexually or otherwise. So there's plenty of ways. Remember, once you travel into the world of the intimate, to the world of the soul, you're very vulnerable. It's a vulnerable place. It's like, would you just trust someone to cut you open and do heart surgery? It's invasive. And when you're, so that's why a spiritual master has to be extremely humble, extremely sensitive, and cannot bring in any of their own agenda. It's one thing you go to a rabbi and ask him, is the chicken kosher? That's not necessarily an intimate experience. But when you start talking about your personal life, about your soul's journey, that's one of the reasons that a lot of care has to be taken, because there could be abuse on that level.
So you talk about Jewish mysticism. One of its unique matters is bringing the soul into matter as opposed to stepping away from it. How does it affect, in a personal way, your relationships with yourself, with those around you? How has it changed your relationships?
Well, I'll be personal. When I by nature, I'm more of an artist, free spirit. I'm not the domestic type. If I followed my own heart's desires, I probably would never have gotten married. Not because I love my wife, I love my children, don't get me wrong in that way, but it's not my nature. My nature is, I'm a floater. I travel the world, and this, music, art, spirit. But I realized, and perhaps probably by upbringing, that I need to be grounded, because it's easy to float like that, and it's also selfish in a way. As spiritual as it is, spirituality could also be very selfish. It's about you, except it's not making money. It's transcendence. It's spiritual enlightenment, higher consciousness. So for me, it was a very real challenge. But I made the decision, and I knew that I needed, because it would have been dangerous probably if I remained that way, because I would be experimenting with things. I would have no, to me, the halacha ultimately was like also guardrails.
What's interesting is you're saying it's Jewish mysticism that helped you have those guardrails, as well as the creativity to ground you in your relationships.
Yeah, but ultimately it was a commitment that I have to I can't just indulge in my spiritual aspirations. I need to ground it. I need to be channeled into a real life. And build, like I learned from Avram Avinu, you have to build a family. I always tell people, look, who are the greatest leaders in the secular world? Biggest philosopher in the Western world, Aristotle, most people say. The biggest, greatest artist, Rembrandt, Van Gogh, whatever. Musicians, Mozart, Beethoven, Bach. I mean, the list goes on. Shakespeare, the greatest literature. Do we know if they had children or grandchildren? They left a legacy. They left plenty of beautiful things, but they didn't turn it into a community. And that to me was that resonated. That's why I said it's not just spirituality and material. There's God. You have to have the bittul, even of your spirituality. You have to get out of the comfort zone of your own spirit and do what's right, not always what you like to do, even if it's spiritual.
Beautiful. We've had an incredible conversation about Jewish spirituality, about Jewish mysticism. Instead of talking about it, just to end, can you share one teaching? What is one mystical teaching that you either carry with you right now, you think can resonate with others?
Yeah. The one that most that comes to mind, I mean, there's so many, is human suffering. Let's talk about how does mysticism, because it's like one of the most difficult topics, because it's emotional. And even if you have it all figured out in your mind, when your heart is broken, your heart is broken. A loss is a loss. So I found the idea of tzimtzum, which is a doctrine taught by the Arizal. Tzimtzum means concealment. That for God to create existence, since God is an all-pervasive reality, there's no room, space for anything else. I'm quoting now Eitz Chaim. That's one of the classic works of the Kabbalistic master, the Arizal, one of the greatest, maybe the greatest mystic. So God, so to speak, like a teacher would withdraw or recede his ideas, so leaving room for a student. So God in some way left space, but in the process concealed his presence, which allows for free will and allows for us to be. So in essence, all suffering and all pain is really a product of God's concealment. So to me, that's a mind-blowing revolutionary idea, because it's not just, okay, you'll find God even in the concealment, but the very concealment itself is a godly, it's just a different way of God expressing. It's like, think of, in the name of love, you want to express something to the person you love, but you have to prepare yourself, so you fall silent. So they think you're silent. And truth is the deepest love, because you're preparing to reveal something even deeper. So never think that silence is really silence. So in many ways, suffering is a form of divine silence, but don't ever see it as an end in itself. It has a tremendous amount of potency. And that's why because remember, pain is very powerful. It's just negative energy. So when you tap into it, you can release tremendous power. Now, of course, we want to reveal it. We don't want to, that to me is one of the very fundamental topic, because it's addressing a difficult topic. It's one thing, there's the beautiful mystical topics of seeing the infinite in a rose or in a flower, but to be able to see God in darkness is very difficult.
Well, Rabbi Simon Jacobson, this conversation was enlightening and reflects the incredible knowledge and sagacity that you take with you everywhere. And we hope that you can continue to show the light and to help everyone come closer toward a meaningful life.
Thank you so much. It was an honor.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Thank you very much.